How do you control the mind? The first thing I think is so important to realize is that our mind is not something with which we want to go to war. So frequently when we embark on the spiritual path, the message is sort of the mind is the enemy. You need to control the mind, whip the mind into shape, get the mind, you're the master, the mind is the slave. And it really creates this duality. Because if I say to you, who are you? And I just said, free associate. Take 60 seconds and tell me who you are. Inevitably, within that is going to be a lot of things that are really connected to the mind. That which has happened to us, which we remember, so we hold memories. How we remember it, that's all mind. Things we can do, our intelligence, that's mind. What we think about, that's mind. What we feel, our emotions, we may say, I feel it in my heart, but the activity is actually in the brain. We can stimulate emotions by putting metal probes into people's brains and stimulating different areas, so that's mind. So the idea of waging this war against something which really embodies the vast majority of how most of us identify as ourselves creates an unnecessary sense of negativity, conflict, and then of course failure. Because you don't win the war with your mind. The control comes through understanding the mind, befriending the mind, and by having an awareness of who you are that's separate from the mind. And then automatically, because see, it's not the mind itself that's the problem. We say, how do you control the mind? But really the question is, how do you control the thoughts? Right? I mean, nobody says, my God, I can't believe it that I still know how to multiply. When am I going to learn to forget how to multiply? When am I going to, forget how to balance my checkbook? When will I forget my child's phone number? We're not looking forward to a degeneration of the mind. So when we say, how do we control the mind? Really what we're simply saying is, how do I stop being plagued by thoughts that are not taking me in a conducive direction? And when we think about it like that, the problem is much smaller. Because the mind is actually a wonderful friend to us. It's the storehouse of our memories. It's the storehouse of the intelligence that we've gotten from going to school, from learning things, from reading, from living in the world. The problem is just the thoughts. And it's the thoughts that are what we'll call illusions. So they're thoughts that are based on, you are this body. This body is separate than the people around you. Therefore, we have jealousy. I'm separate from this other one. I am this body. This body isn't as tall or thin or beautiful or young or rich as I'd like it to be. This body isn't currently in the city that I'd like it to be. It's not in the marriage I'd like it to be. It's not in the job I'd like it to be. And that creates suffering. So the thoughts that we want freedom from are thoughts that are rooted really in what we'll call this ignorant association and identification with this body. And when we start to have an awareness of actually who we are, of actually that that spark, that we're not the container we're in. The sun that's being reflected in different containers isn't so worried about how wide the container is, or narrow the container is, or tall the container is, or short the container is, or whether the container is sitting in, Bali or the ghettos of Detroit. What matters is that container is able to reflect the sun. And in the same way, our identification with this container is what ends up creating the problems. So in terms of how to control our thoughts, well, the great thing is that thoughts really tend to be habits. The vast majority of the thoughts that go through our mind, if you actually could put a recorder in there and record what goes through our mind, the vast majority of them really have nothing to do with us. The overwhelming majority, we're told 95% of what we think and how we act is based on subconscious programming from the age of 6 and younger. That's what experts say. 95%. They say only 5% of the time are we actually in the present moment in our mind. The rest of the time, the mind is somewhere else, based on that subconscious programming, either in the memories themselves or in the consequences of the memories. You're so stupid, you're so ugly, you're such a failure, oh my God, why did you say that? Why did you do this? Oh my God, how worthless you are, how could you be so stupid? This unconscious commentary that goes on 95% of the time. And they say that subconscious mind is programmed primarily before the age of 6, which means our poor parents, who themselves were very young, themselves were very inexperienced, in most cases really who did the very best that they knew how to do. We look back at people who, we look now at people who are 23, 24, 25, 28. We think they're kids. And then we realize, oh my God, that's the age my parents were when I was young, and how I've held them up to this concept of perfection. When today I look at kids that age and I think, God, they shouldn't even be, driving a car. They're babies. So what those sweet parents did, what our teachers said, what somebody else said, what a family member said, what the commercials said, what some friends at school said, all of that has formed, tragically, what motivates 95% of our life. And the problem with that is that the mind, which is conscious, so the intention, which is conscious, says, I don't want to think like that anymore. And we do affirmations and we take pledges. The problem is all of those are in that conscious mind. When we're conscious and aware, we're not having those thoughts. But if we're spending 95% of our time running records that were written years ago and just engaged in habitual patterns, new day, new place, new people, but the script is the same. And so what we realize then is actually really beautiful and really exciting, which is that it's not so much a matter of how can we change that subconscious programming. We can, and there's lots of techniques. Meditation is one of the greatest. But we even have a better tool, or a faster and easier tool in our hands, which is to simply extend that percentage of time we're conscious. If instead of being in the present moment only 5% of the time, I can actually switch those percentages and be in the present moment 95% of the time, then I'm not going to fall into the pattern of my subconscious programming. I'm going to be thinking about where I am in the present with consciousness, with intention, with awareness. And those are the times that were great. And that's where the practice of mindfulness comes in. It's not saying, let's go back and rewrite your subconscious mind. It's saying, let's give you full conscious control of your mind. Not that you're telling it what to think, but that you're just bringing it into the present moment when that which you think is of the present. And it's not playing scripts from the past. So the practice, the very, very simple practices of mindfulness, of simply being aware as you're doing things. Literally saying in your mind, now I'm doing this, now I'm doing that. Bringing the awareness back. Now here's what I'm feeling now. Here's my breath now. The breath is probably the easiest and best way to stay present in the moment. It's nearly impossible to be back 20 years ago or 30 years ago when you're deeply connected to your breath. There's something about the breath that brings us right here into the present moment. And then, in terms of dealing with that subconscious mind and that subconscious programming, the good news is that we now know that the brain keeps changing. And there's an expression in neurology that says, neurons that fire together, wire together. What that means is, if a young girl, every time her parents turned off the lights to go to sleep, her brother beat her up in their bedroom, this young girl is going to associate darkness with pain and fear and anxiety. Now, 30 years later, she's afraid of the dark. Doesn't have conscious connection of why, but is always terrified of the dark. A great deal of energy is spent in her life now with her husband or other roommates. Why in the world do you need a nightlight? You're an adult, the nightlight disturbs me. Come on, can't we turn off the light? It creates great conflict. And this is just one example. Those neurons in her brain that fired together so many nights in a row, darkness, pain, darkness, pain, darkness, pain, wired together. They became linked neurologically, like Pavlov's dogs with the bell and the food. But the good news is we can rewire our brains. And that's becoming easier and easier to do. So the more that we fill our brains with positive associations, that'll become the new pattern. And then automatically the thoughts will go away. It's not a matter then of us doing battle with the thoughts, so much as us changing the entire landscape of our minds so that there's no place for them. You know, if you've got weeds growing in your garden, either you keep picking the weeds, but if you live somewhere with 4 seasons, for example, if you live in, New York, let's say, or Pennsylvania, and it's end of November, well, rather than driving yourself crazy picking all the weeds out of the garden, you realize in a couple of weeks, the minute the first snow comes, the ground is going to frost over anyway. And if we can just change those seasons in our own mind, that which was growing in the former season isn't going to be able to grow in this season anyway. So rather than finding ourselves doing battle with the weeds, if we can just change the season into something where those weed-like thoughts don't exist or can't exist,